But first to the immigration scandal and the 83 hardcore criminals now free on our streets. The government promised these criminals would be under strict supervision, but that doesn't appear to be happening. 1/3 of the criminals were released to a motel in WA on the weekend. A journalist from the West Australian spent the night at this motel and reported a serious absence of supervision with no conditions placed on them. He wrote this: the federal government repeatedly said the Australian Border Force and WA Police were managing the 32 unlawful non-citizens released into Perth after the High Court ruled last Wednesday their indefinite detention was unlawful. However, the Australian Border Force and WA Police were nowhere to be seen on Monday and Tuesday as the group were left to freely explore Thornley, a Perth suburb notorious for its crime. The journalist described scenes of chaos, with one inmate boasting about drug use. There was talk of buying alcohol before they piled into cars and drove around Perth. Peter Dutton today described this as a taxpayer-funded holiday.
You see in WA, in Perth, you've got these people having a holiday in a motel at taxpayers' expense. And the minister yesterday misled the parliament when he says that there are rigorous conditions imposed on these people. How are they being enforced?
How are they being enforced? Well, that's a good question. The ABC reported today that some of the detainees released from immigration detention were sent into the community without visas. This means that they would have been under no restrictions at all and no monitoring either. The ABC reported that at least a dozen people left immigration detention on the weekend as unlawful non-citizens, and they only had their bridging visas confirmed on Monday and Tuesday. The government at first denied this in question time today, but then sidestepped the issue of when exactly the bridging visas were granted.
The ABC has just reported that following the High Court decision, the government released some of the 80 hardened criminals, which include murderers, rapists and child sex offenders, into the community without a visa. Is this true?
I say again, complying with the orders of the High Court is not optional. It is incumbent on this government and on any government. All those who have been required by the decision of the court to be released have been placed on appropriate visas with appropriate conditions, and as I've outlined at some length in the chamber, there has been quite an extensive process of engagement with relevant law enforcement authorities.
Well, as you heard, the Immigration Minister Andrew Giles clearly didn't answer the question there. But for those who have been released with a bridging visa, the only consequence for violating their visa conditions would be to detain them pending removal. But as you know, the High Court has ruled out detention as an option. It said ongoing detention indefinitely is unlawful. So it appears the visa conditions may be unenforceable. As James Patterson pointed out in the Senate today, it seems there are no workable restrictions or conditions potentially on any of these 83 criminals who've now been released. Patterson describes this as an elaborate ruse. Now, this whole scandal emerged after the High Court last week ruled indefinite detention was illegal and unconstitutional. The government, apparently unprepared for the ruling, had no plan to keep the public safe from murderers, rapists and sex pests, now free after this High Court decision. Immigration Minister Andrew Giles spoke about just how dangerous some of these asylum seekers are who are now on the streets.
The decision of the High Court, which required release, affects some very, very serious offenders, including people who have committed the offences you've described. Sex offenders, a murderer, at least one murderer. I believe there are 3 murderers. There are several sex offenders.
The opposition has been in uproar, claiming the government is out of its depth on national security and that it was their responsibility to prepare for this outcome of the High Court.
We've now got a government who is asleep at the wheel and has allowed 81 hardcore criminals out into the community at a time when there is already, in many parts of the country, very significant law and order issues where Victims, as we see on the news every night, are suffering because the justice system is failing them. We're not talking about people here who have been low-level offenders. We're talking about murderers and rapists and pedophiles and people who would pose a threat to our national security. What higher order priority could the Prime Minister have than dealing with this issue?
And Dutton has now demanded emergency legislation to keep the public safe from these criminals. And Shadow Immigration Minister Dan Tehan says Parliament should not rise until the issue is resolved. But the government appears to be at odds over whether or not legislation is the answer to this. On rival breakfast television programs today, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill said no legislation can get around the High Court decision, but then Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles said that legislation was being examined.
The idea that it is open to the Australian government to simply legislate away a High Court decision is not how our Constitution works.
In terms of looking at legislative options going forward, we are examining all of that in the face of this decision.
A clear contradiction there. And the government is under immense public pressure now over this scandal, and it does appear that they'll have to rush through legislation this week. There's public outrage that the 83 criminals are receiving welfare and taxpayer-funded accommodation. And there's concern for community safety, with Dutton suggesting that communities should be warned if the criminals are going to be living among them, because many, he says, are repeat offenders. And he argues some of the criminals should be deported even if their country of origin has the death penalty. He says there's precedent for this.
I'm not going into individual cases, but there are plenty of negotiations that can take place for a person to be returned and assurances given about the death penalty or about penalties otherwise. That has happened in a number of cases over a long period of time. So what is the consequence of the Prime Minister failing? Well, sadly, there will be more victims of these criminals because these are repeat offenders. These are people that haven't just raped or molested one individual. And if we need to advise communities to keep them safe, that's what should happen.
This immigration scandal has further exposed the Albanese government as weak on national security. And it's also contributed to a sense of a government in chaos, lacking in leadership and unable to get a handle on major, foreseeable and preventable scandals. The reality is this. It's 18 months since Albanese swept to office. Over the past few months, the government he leads has proven to be reactive to events, its priorities are confused, it has the wrong instincts, and it's not in tune with public sentiment. Just have a think about the failures and ineptitude over the past few months. The Voice campaign and then the referendum defeat. The misinformation legislation that would be better suited to a communist dictatorship, yet the government stubbornly persists with it, despite the backlash from both the left and the right. Then there's Albanese's weak response to the rise in anti-Semitism as a result of petty politics and votes in Western Sydney. His failure to unequivocally stand up and address the rise in this ancient hatred to stop the danger on our streets further endangers our Jewish community. His decision to visit our enemy in China, but not our friend in Israel. Then there's the radical industrial relation laws that have seen every employer group and business body join together in protest. There's inflation and the cost of living crisis that's seeing more Australian families go hungry than at any other time this century. And don't forget the COVID inquiry that excludes the states, letting them off the hook, meaning there'll be no lessons learned of health measures for the next pandemic. And of course, the Qantas scandal, where a commercial advantage was given to the national airline, even though it meant pushing up airfares for Australians. The worst breakdown in social cohesion and racism we've seen in years is now arising on our streets. It's happening under Anthony Albanese's watch, and he's doing nothing about it. This is unfolding at the same time as a painful cost of living crisis that's crippling hundreds of thousands of families. Does this government realise It needs to govern for all Australians, not just Green left voters in Labor seats. It can't abandon Jewish Australians, and it can't abandon vulnerable battlers. Yet Albanese is spending most of his time overseas at the moment. He's heading off on his 20th overseas trip this week. And when he's overseas, he refuses to take questions on what he calls domestic issues. But this is his way of avoiding having to comment on the mounting crises that are happening under his prime ministership. We have to ask, who is actually leading the country and who is in charge of our national security?